Okay, thank you for the introduction, Dr. Bremer, and to the organizers and to the board. I'm going to jump right in. I have a lot of slides. For over half a century, residents of dozens of villages and towns in the Swiss and Austrian Alps have observed a curious phenomenon. In mid-July, ski hotels and rental flats that might otherwise sit dormant for the summer season fill with visitors wearing atypical garb: men with black hats and dark suits, women in long sleeves and modest skirts. Supermarkets open kosher food aisles. Walking trails fill with Yiddish and Hebrew-speaking visitors. Rented community halls operate as Jewish prayer spaces. By late August, most of these visitors disappear as mysteriously as they arrived. Orthodox Jews have traveled to the Alps for vacation and healing from at least the late 19th century. More recently, Haredi, which is to say strictly Orthodox Jews from Europe, Israel, and North America, have comprised a prominent, conspicuous segment of summer visitors in many Swiss and Austrian resorts. Kosher hotels, minyan lists, and the presence of thousands of Haredi visitors have shaped a vast transnational Haredi Alpine landscape with ever-evolving boundaries and landmarks. Less evident has been the role of revered Haredi rabbis, not only in fashioning the ritualized seasonal Alpine visit, but in characterizing and demarcating Alpine space on the ground and in the imaginations of the Haredi public. Rabbis and the rabbinic mountain walk constitute key topographical features in the Haredi Alpine geography. Following a brief history of the Haredi Alps development and scope, this paper will examine the role of Haredi rabbinical visits and their portrayal in text and image, and the construction of the tangible and symbolic Haredi Alpine landscape. And I'll just add that I'm using Haredi as an umbrella term to describe both Hasidic and non-Hasidic, strictly Orthodox communities. The history of Orthodox Jewish mass leisure culture in Central Europe dates to the early 19th century. The passion for taking the waters in grand spas appealed to Orthodox Jews as much as to anyone else. They too believed in the curative properties of spa treatments. In particular, the Bohemian spas of Marienbad and Karlsbad attracted traditionalist Judaism's royalty, famed Talmudic scholars, and Hasidic rebbes. Great rabbis were celebrities in the resort towns. Crowds observed the rabbinic carriage rides or promenades through the spa parks. Photographers jostled to capture rabbinic likenesses as they sipped mineral water. Rabbis became themselves an attraction of the resort towns. Their public appearances became topographical features marking the landscape. For over a century, the Haredi public has delighted in the stories and photographs of previous generations' rabbinical greats in the famed resorts. Since World War II, the woods, gardens, and baths of Marienbad have not functioned as palpably Jewish spaces, but the metaphysical Jewish Marienbad endures in the received memories and hagiographical texts of contemporary Haredim. In the mid-19th century, the leisure landscape of Central Europe expanded as Romanticism, the popularity of mountain sports, and medical opinions on the benefits of mountain air directed travelers and tuberculosis patients to the Alps. A Jewish infrastructure of kosher hotels and sanatoria arose in the prominent Swiss and Austrian resort towns. Jewish newspapers and kosher guides showcased an enticing array of properties in the Alps and beyond, delineating an expansive Jewish leisure landscape. Most traditionalist Jews visiting the Alps before the World Wars dressed similarly and harmonized culturally with non-Jewish society. Their Alpine Jewish spaces were discreet. By and large, the strictly Orthodox, especially Hasidic Jews, remained faithful to the Bohemian and Polish spas through the late 1930s. World War II would change the face of European Jewry not only through its human and cultural toll, but by shifting its leisure habits. Few, if any, surviving Jewish hoteliers reestablished their lodgings in places with decimated Jewish populations. But notably, Switzerland's Jewish community and its kosher tourist infrastructure remained intact. Both the Swiss and Austrian Alps soon assumed an important position as a leisure and health tourism destination for Haredi rabbis and economic elites. Haredi rabbinic leaders tended to be elderly and burdened with communal responsibilities, a combination often necessitating periods of rest. Most were necessarily mobile. A dispersed Haredi diaspora on multiple continents demanded their attentions. This combination led a significant number of prominent rabbis to frequent Alpine health spas, reviving the pre-war tradition of Jewish and specifically rabbinic health tourism and designating the Alps their favorite destination. From the late 1940s, revered rabbis of nearly all major Hasidic groups and Haredi yeshiva heads traveled to the Alps, often bringing entourages or attracting crowds of followers. Many visited every summer, ritualizing the Alpine vacation. In the 1980s, with Haredi demographic expansion and the rise of the middle class, the number of Haredi rabbis and their followers traveling annually to the Alps intensified. The phenomenon has continued to expand until the present day, especially with increasing numbers of laity organizing visits. Still, the rabbinic visits launched Haredi, the Haredi love affair with the Alps, and have always anchored Haredi tourism in the Alps. The main centers of the Alpine Haredi landscape have been Davos, Arosa, St. Moritz, Schkuhl, Grindelwald, and Bad Gastein. But other locations on this map, and others not featured, have been sites of significant Haredi tourism since World War II. Some of these places have attracted strictly Orthodox Jews for over a century. Haredi visitors and trip organizers constructed a tangible Haredi landscape in these leisure places: kosher hotels, non-kosher hotels rented out by Haredi groups, permanent synagogues, temporary synagogues in tents or community halls, kosher aisles and groceries, all represent a concrete, if malleable, Haredi landscape that has evolved from year to year based on Haredi tastes. The spa of Schkuhl, for example, has appeared and disappeared on the Haredi landscape map, first featuring as a major place of rabbinic travel in the late 1940s, then falling away with the closure of the kosher hotel in 1959, then reappearing 50 years later when another kosher hotel opened, and then declining when that kosher hotel closed a few years later. The Haredi landscape also revolves around the large numbers of visibly Haredi visitors who mark the space, sometimes inflaming tensions with local non-Jewish residents. 2 summers ago, a new Torah scroll was inaugurated for a kosher hotel in Davos. Hundreds of Haredi guests celebrated an outdoor procession coordinated with local officials, but it did not stop social media from erupting with anti-Jewish sentiment. "We are not in Israel, we are in Switzerland," wrote one local. "Our homeland is lost," wrote another. Haredi visits were concentrated in a few summer weeks, and such public events were exceptional, but some locals were threatened by the expansion of this ephemeral Jewish space. In the 1980s, tensions were high between local residents and Haredi guests in Arosa, Switzerland. In a clear reference to the Haredi landscape, some locals complained of street scenes like from a Galician shtetl. Haredi visitors have organized Jewish prayer in seasonal synagogue spaces, often rented from local municipalities, in places where there is no kosher hotel with an in-house synagogue, or in places like Davos, where the thousands of Haredi guests each summer require many prayer spaces. In some resort towns like Zerfaus and Davos, as seen here, Haredi visitors have secured separate gender swimming hours in local pools, so-called kosher swimming. Large non-Jewish supermarkets have learned about the many Haredi visitors who arrive in the Alps each summer and have opened kosher aisles and groceries in locations with large Jewish concentrations. In addition to these concrete Jewish spaces in kosher hotels, prayer spaces, and kosher aisles of groceries, Haredi guests have mapped the limits of their tourist landscape. In Hinterglemm, Austria, which had a successful kosher hotel until the pandemic, the municipality allowed an eruv to be put up around much of the village every summer for over a decade. The map not only instructed Jewish, mainly Haredi guests, where they could carry on the Sabbath, but also informed them where the Jewish visitors in the village resided. The eruv also had the effect of limiting where most Haredim would rent apartments in the village. In Davos, Switzerland, Haredi visitors produced a map delineating the Tchum Shabbos, the distance beyond which Orthodox Jewish visitors staying in Davos cannot walk on the Sabbath. So we see here the dotted line represents the town limits according to Jewish law, and the double red lines represent the point beyond which Orthodox visitors cannot walk on the Sabbath. Parallel to the expansion of the physical Haredi Alpine landscape, the Haredi community has defined its landscape through lists of kosher hotels and Jewish prayer gatherings in the Alps. Here are lists of hotels and restaurants in Switzerland and Austria in 1989. By this time, the establishments in the mountains were visited largely by a Haredi clientele. And here I have lists also from 1980 and 2017 from Switzerland that show a lot of the changes. If you compare the two lists, only the Hotel Metropole in Arosa is the same. Older kosher hotels closed and new ones appeared on the scene, sometimes in the same villages or towns and sometimes in entirely new locations. From year to year, hotels open and close, minyanim are organized or disband. The Haredi Alpine landscape contracts or expands according to contemporary tastes and outside limitations, like the pandemic. Here we see examples from the lists published every year in the Jüdische Zeitung, the Haredi newspaper of Switzerland, listing every summer the minyanim, the Jewish prayer gatherings, either established minyanim or people who are trying to start a minyan in a resort town. And here's another list from 2017 that shows all of the fixed minyanim in the Austrian Alps. I will devote the remainder of my time to the rabbinic mountain walk, an important health ritual for rabbis in the Alps, just as it was for those in pre-war Bohemian spa towns. The walks that rabbis have taken in the Alps, in many cases on doctor's orders, indeed, that is the reason that many have traveled to the Alps in the first place, for quiet mountain air and exercise, is a clear way in which Haredi space has been constructed in the Alps, especially by those who witness these walks. But before we get into the specifics of that, I would be remiss if I didn't show evidence of the rabbinic walk also as a family space. These may be rabbis whose every word was cherished by their students and adherents, but they're also fathers and husbands who use their vacation time for a family purpose. And yet, try as they might to enjoy some privacy, they can't walk in the Alps without photographers recording their every movement. The photos here in my collection, I suspect, were taken by a family member, and yet they became sought after by the Haredi public, which is fascinated by every aspect of the lives of their spiritual leaders. Just as in relation to the Bohemian spa towns pre-World War II, the Orthodox Jewish press and photographers were primary actors in linking the rabbinic persona and the leisure landscape for the laity and for future generations. Photographs of Haredi leaders in the Alps have circulated for as long as they have visited, but in the last 25 years, the Haredi market features half a dozen pictorial magazines that print photos from the goings-on in Haredi communities worldwide. Along with hagiographic works that publish relevant histories and rabbinic lore, including from the Alps, the photographs in these magazines have helped in the construction of the Alps and mountain landscapes as Jewish, and as specifically Haredi rabbinic spaces for the Haredi public. Here are some more representative pages from Haredi pictorial magazines that show different Hasidic Rebbes walking in the Alps. On the left and the right, you have two different brothers who are both Rebbes. One is in Austria, one is in Switzerland. And in the center circle, you have their father, who previously would also go every summer to the Swiss Alps and sort of inaugurated this family rabbinic tradition. Beyond the tangible Haredi landscape of the Alps, a symbolic landscape developed in Haredi text, image, lore, and memory. These Alps represent an ethereal, Edenic space where saintly rabbis stroll against sublime mountain backgrounds. Rabbinic giants are topographical features no less prominent than the towering mountains. Stories or photos of rabbis facing the Alps elevate their subjects, whether the account evinces estrangement or enchantment with the natural scenes. In some representations, rabbinic visitors blend naturalistically into the Alpine landscape. As the Jewish spiritual aristocracy, they belong in the places that exemplify the awesomeness of the divine creation. The rabbis in the Alps are topographical features in concert. Each confirms the greatness of the other. Other iterations of the Haredi Alpine landscape position the rabbinic greats not in concert with the natural beauty, but in contrast to it, as representations of spiritual eminence towering over mountains that are merely earthly distractions. Many Haredi hagiographies feature accounts of rabbinic travels to the Alps and include stories by those who accompanied the rabbis, with testimonies about rabbinical conduct on vacation. Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, head of the Brisk Yeshiva, traveled to Shkuol for regular spa treatments after World War II until his death in 1959. A student, enraptured by the mountains, recounted a conversation in which the rabbi restrained his emotional abandon. Once, while we sat on a bench in Switzerland, I said that I felt null and void in relation to the colossal mountains before us. The rabbi responded, "Why should I nullify myself before mountains? I am a man, and it is inanimate. I have nothing to envy about its greatness. But if two Torah scholars sat here and engaged in lively debate, of course I would feel null and void in relation to them." The moral of the story is clear. Jewish scholars are giants who tower over the Alps in spiritual importance. Mountains are inconsequential. The rabbi had traveled to Shkuol for its mineral water, and that was all. Biographers record that Rabbi Moshe Hager, the Rebbe of the Vizhnitzer Hasidim, asserted strong indifference to the Alpine scenery. A grandchild accompanying him on a visit to St. Moritz emphasized the point regarding the rabbi's daily mountain walk. Quote, He never asked to change his walking path. Rather, for 2 months every summer, he walked on the same path, despite the universal custom to change one's path, to keep things fresh. However, his only purpose in walking was for his health, to breathe fresh air and nothing more, so he had no need to refresh the view. For the same reason, he never looked around to enjoy the beauty of the place. It did not interest him at all. Rabbi Hager visited the Swiss Alps more than 25 times between 1972 and 1998, each visit for around 8 weeks, almost always in St. Moritz. He took the same path, or actually the same 2 paths, on his daily walks, which his Chassidim came to identify as the Vishnitzer Weg, the Vishnitz Trail, or path. He verbalized his disinterest in the natural beauty, even as he instilled it with meaning for his followers. They understand that the towering topographical feature is the rabbi, not the mountains. And to the Chassid of Vishnitz, even today, the important topographical feature in St. Moritz isn't any of the surrounding mountain peaks. It is the Vishnitzer Weg, where the traces of their previous Rebbe are still felt, and where his walks continued in perpetuity in the photographs and stories that keep the path alive. Haredi texts demonstrate that some rabbinic visitors profited richly from their natural surroundings. In fact, the father of the aforementioned Rabbi Hager was his predecessor as Vishnitzer Rebbe, his father. A travel companion records his pleasure and interest on mountain walks. Quote, Hager knew how to read and write well in foreign languages. In St. Moritz, the rabbi would read the signs along all the trails. This is how he walked every day. The path that we took yesterday, we didn't walk on the next day. Sometimes he selected a strenuous route leading up to a mountain peak, hiking for up to 3 hours at a time. End quote. In printed accounts and photos, Rabbi Hager appears as genuinely enjoying his Alpine visits. The grandeur of the mountains in the photos and in the stories symbiotically affirm his own lofty rabbinic position. The elder Rabbi Hager was not alone in his enchantment with the Alpine landscapes. In a eulogy for revered mystic Rabbi Chaim Aryeh Erlanger, his son recalled that his father approached Alpine hikes as a spiritual opportunity. We, his children, remember well how he instructed and guided us during the vacation period in the mountains of Switzerland, when he came to hike with us on the high mountains. And when we arrived at a wondrous spot facing the magnificent and beautiful view, he used to sing the melodies of the days of awe with cleaving to God and longing. And he would say about these spots that the air is very pure and we feel closeness to God. Many times when we arrived to such places, he would say, who knows if someone has ever discussed a holy matter in this place? And we would study a Mishnah or another piece of Torah, and he would teach us. Already we have found in his manuscripts of Torah commentaries items that were written in the Swiss Alps on a high mountain. In a July 1974 letter, Rabbi Yochanan Sofer of the Erloi community wrote to his students in Jerusalem that he had arrived safely in Bad Gastein, quote, a bathing place from the springs of salvation and recuperation. He explained that his Austrian sojourn would enable him to, quote, return to the Holy Land with refreshed strength, healthy and strong to serve God. Sofer devoted several lines to Bad Gastein's topographical features and natural beauty. Quote, this place is wondrous. Large snow-capped mountains encircle it on all sides, nearly 3,000 meters high, and the town itself sits in a valley of over 1,000 meters altitude. Springs flow from every corner, including the medicinal springs, of course. On the mountains, the snow is visible on the peaks. I am full of wonder and amazement. How great are your works, God! You have made them all with wisdom. An architect takes such pains to design even a small building, preparing blueprints in the construction, whereas the Holy One, blessed be his name, created a wonderful world, heaven and earth, mountains and hills, seas and rivers in 6 days without fatigue. Sofer articulated his appreciation of the Alpine scenery by incorporating it into his religious worldview. The Alps did not merely offer sensory gratification, but also the spiritual experience of delighting in the grandeur of the natural creation, of the divine creation. The letter, printed in a hagiographic work, confirms to his followers not only that the Alps are a place of godliness, but how appropriate it is that their holy rabbi spent time there. All right, this is my last slide. For over half a century, strictly Orthodox Jews have carried on a love affair with the Swiss and Austrian Alps. Whether they were estranged from the materiality of the mountains or enchanted by the sublime scenery, Haredi crowds and especially revered rabbis have concretely and symbolically engaged with its spaces and imbued them with meaning. An ever-growing, increasingly prosperous Haredi community on both sides of the Atlantic shows every sign of continuing to visit the Alps and continuing to construct and expand its Jewish landscape. Thank you.